Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. A split today in the Teals as other MPs desperately try and distance themselves from Kylia Tink and Sophie Scamps, who backed a Greens motion against Israel. But they're not alone. A Labor backbencher also has broken ranks, calling for Israel to be condemned as terrorist Hamas start to release videos of their Jewish hostages. Biology says that sex matters, that it's binary, but not so, says the Australian Human Rights Commission, in a landmark hearing that's got huge ramifications for women and our single-sex spaces like change rooms, domestic violence shelters and more. Senator Claire Chandler exposes the latest attempt by a body to erase women and girls in Australia. Plus, Warren Mundine. Well, he took aim at the media class on Saturday night and boy, he didn't miss. Tonight he'll share a letter with you where a man was moved to tears by what happened on the weekend as he stood by himself on a polling booth for 11 hours just to support the no case. And the Prime Minister, the big loser out of the Voice referendum, evasive and under pressure again today as he was pursued over his continuing push for a Makaratta Treaty Commission.
And he's not a conviction politician, he's a coward.
Will the Prime Minister be honest and upfront with Australians and inform the House whether or not he remains committed to a treaty and truth-telling process?
Does the Prime Minister remain committed to treaty and truth-telling?
On Sunday, the Deputy Prime Minister declared, quote, "We have committed to implementing the Uluru Statement in full." Does the Deputy Prime Minister stand by this statement?
But first, it's pretty obvious that Yes supporters are having trouble coming to grips with the magnitude of their loss. They may not like the result, but they've just got to accept it if they really believe in democracy. On Saturday night, the Prime Minister said that he accepted the result and he agreed that yes and no voters alike were all Australian, before basically relitigating the whole failed yes case.
Look, we accept the result.
Yeah.
We accept the outcome. We are not yes voters or no voters. We are all Australians. And it is as Australians together that we must take our country beyond this debate without forgetting why we had it in the first place. Because too often in the life of our nation and in the political conversation, the disadvantage confronting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been relegated to the margins. This referendum and my government has put it right at the centre.
No such acceptance from Indigenous activists, though. Instead of accepting defeat, as Prime Ministers and opposition leaders routinely must, the main Indigenous yes backers have declared a week of silent mourning, as if a democratic outcome should ever be mourned, and effectively shut up shop rather than admit they massively overreached. Very few referendums have been defeated as decisively as this one. Yet having lost the voice, the Prime Minister is still keen on the rest of the Uluru trifecta. After saying for many months that the government was committed to implementing the Uluru Statement in full, voice first, then treaty, then truth, he seems inclined to push on with the rest of the agenda, even though it wasn't just the voice that was rejected on Saturday, it was the whole separatist mindset that Uluru exemplified. Now, this is extraordinary arrogance, even for Labor, and extraordinary political stupidity too, given that at last count, over 40% of the Labor vote abandoned the Prime Minister on Saturday. And I give you the tip, keep pushing on with a treaty and they won't be coming back. Today in Question Time on his Makaratta Treaty Commission, again and again, the PM dodged an honest answer.
Will the Prime Minister be honest and upfront with Australians and inform the House whether or not he remains committed to a treaty and truth-telling process?
What I have said very clearly is that I will give respect to Indigenous Australians who have asked for a week to consider their position. I think that is pretty reasonable.
I mean, seriously, can't the PM read the room? Look at the latest count today. The Australian people could not be clearer. And unlike a constitutionally entrenched voice, where he had to ask the people, the government wouldn't need the people's vote to push on with the treaty and truth-telling, because neither are constitutional changes, even though a treaty would change us as a country in every way possible. Now, in the Voice campaign, when I argued that a treaty was part of the PM's plan, that if you voted for a voice, you would get a treaty, I was all but cancelled. It was all there in the full Uluru statement. Yet the Prime Minister, who's admitted he's never even read the full statement anyway, still accused me of running a conspiracy theory.
This is a ripper. That is the Uluru Statement from the Heart on an A4 bit of paper. Nothing exposes the falseness of the arguments being put by the No campaign than this conspiracy theory and nonsense. It's something that has been out there, like a whole lot of the QAnon theories. We have all sorts of conspiracy stuff out there. That is a conspiracy in search of a theory, Mr. Speaker. They're struggling to get their scares straight. I mean, what role did Marcia Langton play in the faking of the moon landing, Mr. Speaker?
Well, who's right now? Because yesterday and today in the Parliament, all the indications from the government are that they will keep pushing on with their Makaratta Treaty plans for a commission that's made up by a majority of Indigenous appointees that'll spend upwards of $27 million in set-up costs alone. And that's, of course, before we factor in the many billions that would come with reparations. And all of this still up there on the Prime Minister's own website. It's like Saturday night never, ever happened. Today, Anthony Albanese pledged to continue to listen to Aboriginal leaders.
Our commitment to listening to Indigenous Australians is undiminished. Our commitment to closing the gap is undiminished. We accepted the invitation from First Nations people, which was given in the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
So he's listening to them, but not to you. I mean, he's arrogantly thumbing his nose at the majority of voters and every single state that rejected his plan for race-based division. If democracy is meant to mean anything, the entire Uluru agenda has got to be junked, not just the Voice, because voters will rightly conclude that the PM doesn't give a tinker's cuss about what everyday Australians think. That he's more than happy to listen to the Aboriginal establishment led by Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton, but not to the voters in Labor's traditional heartland, which have massively rejected the Uluru agenda. And almost nothing would maximise Peter Dutton's chance to make this a one-term government than the PM showing he's got a tin ear, not just once on the Voice, but twice if he goes down this path of treaty. Now, how can a country make a treaty with its own citizens? And why would a self-respecting country ever set up a so-called truth-telling commission, a kind of official self-flagellation society, to tell a one-sided, jaundiced view of our own history? But there's a deeper danger in the left's attempt to delegitimise this referendum result, namely the incessant refrain that yes only failed because of so-called misinformation from the No campaign. For instance, here's Troy Bramston in The Australian today, claiming, and I quote, deliberate misinformation propagated by the No camp on the political and legal implications of the Voice, with Trump-like arguments to sow confusion, resentment and fear. Now, I'm sorry, Troy, a former staffer, of course, for Kevin Rudd. I'm sorry, Troy, but just because some former judges claim that the Voice was legally safe doesn't mean it was so-called misinformation to cite other former judges who said that it wasn't safe. And just because some people claim that the Voice would be no more than an advisory committee doesn't mean that it was misinformation to say, well, it would be, in fact, so much more than that. especially when so many of the latter-day voice minimalists had changed their tune to try and save a floundering proposal. Just because there's a disagreement doesn't mean that the other side is peddling misinformation as opposed to raising inconvenient facts. Inconvenient facts that shouldn't be silenced just because the leftist establishment and big tech doesn't find them persuasive. And you can see where all is heading, can't you? Having lost this referendum, mostly through a good social media campaign from Fair Australia, the left doesn't want to lose again. That's why the government's looking to muzzle social media through the coming legislation against so-called misinformation and disinformation. Now, democracies work this time because the arguments against the voice couldn't be suppressed, because people like me refused to be cancelled and stopped telling you about the full agenda of Uluru, as did Sky News. But if the government gets its way, future no cases will be deplatformed as misinformation. They won't even get a chance to get cancelled because big tech won't allow it. Indeed, won't be allowed to even have them posted online. This is a deeply sinister piece of legislation, and it should be junked along with a voice, along with treaty, if free speech is to mean anything and our democracy is to remain vigorous. Busy day in Canberra, House and Senate sitting, of course. Sky News headlines now with Olivia Coulsley.
Good evening. Teal MPs Allegra Spender, Monique Ryan and Zoe Daniel have distanced themselves from their colleagues, declaring they disagree with Sophie Scomp's and Kylie Tink's decision to support a Greens motion on Palestine. The Greens amendment to the Anthony Albanese motion was to remove this line. The House stands with Israel and recognises its inherent right to defend itself, and replace it with, the House condemns war crimes perpetrated by the State of Israel, including the bombing of Palestinian civilians, and calls for an immediate ceasefire between all parties and an end to the war on Gaza, recognising also that for there to be peace there must be an end to the State of Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Sophie Scomp's released a statement today saying, "Yesterday I voted in favour of the government's motion in relation to Israel in full. That motion unequivocally condemned the attacks on Israel by Hamas and recognised the right of Israel to defend itself. That remains my position." It comes as Israel's ambassador to Australia, Amir Maimon, addressed the coalition party room.
We're in a war that we didn't start nor ask for, but we are determined to win. Yeah.
And as Labor Senator Fatima Payman said, Israel's right to defend itself cannot come at the cost of the deaths of Palestinian civilians.
The killing of innocent civilians in Israel should be condemned, and we condemn it. The killing of innocent civilians in Palestine should also be condemned, and we must condemn it.
Qatar Airways is helping Australians stuck in Israel get home, flying those citizens from Dubai to Sydney. The airline has been at the centre of media attention after the Australian government blocked it from increasing its flights into Australia. The Prime Minister says some Australians are not getting on the flights, and they should.
This is a dangerous situation. If people are seeking to leave and they're offered a place, please take it. Please take it. There have been issues of where it hasn't been taken up. But this is a very volatile situation.
It is believed Qatar is flying the Australians free of charge, and Virgin will provide onward domestic travel.
All right, let's get into it. Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell joins me now from Canberra. We had all those commitments yesterday from the Deputy PM, Andrew, that they are still behind this Makaratta Treaty Commission, but then some backsliding in question time. But today, a real sense the PM's going to leave Indigenous leaders to make the call on this. The money is still in the budget. The work on Makaratta is still being done. I don't think the vote could have been clearer on Saturday night. Australians don't want this race-based separatism. So where do you think Labor's going to go with this Makaratta Treaty?
Well, I don't know, but I would suspect perhaps they're either not going to do it or they're going to kick it off into the grass for a while. But he is a bit hamstrung because he says he's going to listen to Indigenous leaders. So if they insist on it, he's got nowhere to go. But yeah, I mean, you're just stating the obvious in terms of the politics of the situation. It'd be difficult to go ahead with it. I mean, you saw in Western Australia, Peter, the reaction to that Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act. So you've had that, then you've had this. Are you going to keep going? I think he needs to find another way at the moment, the PM.
Look, I think he's in trouble here in terms of integrity. I mean, he said all the way through the lead up to the referendum that this was nothing to do with treaty. It was only focused on the voice, that he kept pushing treaty off. And now we're on the other side where his voice is defeated and he's hanging on to the treaty like it's a life raft. Now, you can't say the treaty's not part of it 2 or 3 days ago and now still be in the parliament. First question today from the opposition, all about Makaratta, and he still can't rule it out despite that vote on Saturday.
I don't believe he's doing it, Peter. I don't believe this Prime Minister will ever get involved in a national treaty process. We'll see. I just don't think he wants to be on the record in a grab.
Good causes in the budget too.
I don't think he wants to be in a grab in the Parliament saying we're not doing the treaty. It's as simple as that.
So you reckon he's going to wait for the Aboriginal leaders to come away from their week of mourning, have some sort of closed-door meeting with them and agree a form of words so he can step aside? Do you think that's how it's going to go?
I think he'll just change the subject. Say there are state treaty processes, but come up with some form of package or some form of measures. I mean, he made the point today that Ullaru's statement from the heart took decades, so don't expect him in a few days to come up with something. I think I don't expect an immediate announcement, but I know enough about his position to know the voice was pretty much it for him. I mean, Linda Burney definitely wanted all three. Albanese thought politically the voice was the only kind of achievable one, and he's got smashed on that. So where does he go? He can hardly go to what are seen as more controversial measures. It just doesn't make any sense. I get what you're saying about not ruling it out, but I really think that's about trying not to offend the Aboriginal leaders at a time they're hurting. I honestly don't think he's got any intention. Yeah,
but he's got, hang on, mate, he's got $27 million in his portfolio, in the government's Indigenous portfolio to bring this about. There's a process requiring an Indigenous majority on this Makaratta. We know the money's been spent. I've spoken to public servants. I know they're doing a lot of work on this. Now, it only goes away if he makes it go away. If he says that money's not being spent, I've shut down the public service, that's the test for him.
Absolutely, but that's the Makaratta, not the treaty, right? I was referring to the treaty. So maybe the Makaratta's more of a chance, but even then, I think... Yeah,
but the Makaratta is treaty. The Makaratta is the body. The Makaratta is the body that was supposedly to sit above the voice, and the government on this side, the voice on that side, the Makaratta was like the umpire to make a treaty happen. Now, if you're not doing treaty, you can't have a Makaratta.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of the Makaratta, and you may know more than me, frankly, Peter, is that it was about getting all the stories out of mistreatment of Aboriginal people, like a Royal Commission type thing.
No, that's the truth telling. That's something different anyway. We will pull this apart. We'll keep pulling this apart. But unless he says Makaratta is gone, Makaratta and treaty is there. I'm not going to let this one go. Hey, I thought it was interesting. The PM, he's got to hide. I mean, he really went after Peter Dutton today, aggressively, I guess, accusing him of being dishonest because Peter Dutton says, look, I'm not going to do that second referendum idea anymore. It's certainly not front of mind for the opposition. He said here on the show last night, I've listened to what Australians have had to say. That couldn't be clearer. How do you think this is going to play out for Peter Dutton if he doesn't have a second referendum?
Oh, I don't think it'll be a drama for him. It is interesting, though. I mean, obviously, he came on with me and said, yes, I'm having a second referendum.
He did.
That's where he got in a bit of a, interesting situation. I mean, in a way, it gave people who were wavering an even bigger reason to vote no, because they thought, we can still get constitutional recognition. But on the other hand, I can see what he's saying. In the face of that result, it's pretty hard to push the idea again for some years. So his position makes sense. But I guess it's convenient. I mean, what would the Prime Minister have if he didn't have that as a comeback today? He's lucky he's got that.
You know a fair bit about campaigns. We're all going through the entrails of what went right and what went wrong with the various campaigns. Yes, 23, they boasted about their first-class strategy team, and they certainly had some big names that I know in political terms. Absolutely lots of Labor and the Greens, you'd expect that. But they had some really high-profile Liberals as well. I reckon it was one of the worst campaigns I've ever seen. So given all the brains trust around the table, they had all the money, of course, they had their media backers, their boardroom backers. Why the spectacular loss, Andrew?
Well, you can't sell an idea that the public aren't interested in, but I tend to agree with you. It obviously wasn't an effective campaign. I mean, I doubt many people know who Dean Parkin is, but everyone knows who Jacinta Price is. So doesn't that speak for itself? And look, you point to these characters, Crosby, Textor. Well, Linton Crosby wasn't involved, of course. Mark Textor certainly was. And you do have intimate knowledge, having worked with them over the years. Let's face it, maybe Textor's strategies are out of date. He was brilliant for Howard, but Howard was pretty damn brilliant, you know. And then he had the Jobs and Growth slogan in 2016. That didn't work. There was a lot of party room discontent at the time at that slogan, at that Crosby-Textor strategy. And where has their success been since? OK, they had a good result in 2019, but plenty of people could have beaten Bill Shorten and his policies, I reckon. So I think it does perhaps make it more of a myth that Mark Textor and his techniques were this absolutely brilliant thing which had helped Howard and the like. There's no doubt Mark Textor's done some great campaign work, but on this occasion he's got to wear that he didn't do very well. It's as simple as that. And a lot of people in this parliament would say the same of the 2016 campaign. So he's been in the game a long time. I imagine he's hurting over this loss, that's for sure, because they didn't get within a bull's roar, did they? I mean, they're going to be under 40%.
No.
It's the worst possible result they could have imagined.
All right, I'll leave it there. Andrew Cornell, thank you as always. All right, last night I criticised, quite rightly I reckon, Sydney Teals, Kylie Tink and Sophie Scamps for joining forces with the Greens to accuse Israel of war crimes 9 days after the terrorist organisation Hamas slaughtered over 1,400 innocent Israelis. The two MPs sought to condemn Israel for war crimes. They've called for an immediate ceasefire. They also sought to erase a statement that said Australia stands with Israel and recognises its inherent right to defend itself. They're in response, the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies condemned the MPs, said their position was completely indefensible and morally reprehensible. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry accused them of having a moral fog that insulted Jewish people. Today, Monique Ryan, though, Allegra Spender and Zoe Daniel, they've all distanced themselves from their fellow Teals. And this followed a statement from Scamps, which looks like she's trying to walk it all back from yesterday's shameful move. Too late, I reckon. Joining me now to get his thoughts on all of this, Alex Rivchin, the CEO or co-CEO, the Australian Council of Australian Jewry. Alex, thank you again for your time. I sort of expected this rot from the Greens, you know, anti-Israel, a whole lot of ignorance. But geez, I was surprised to see that two Teal MPs joined in. What was your reaction?
Well, I was as surprised as you, but, you know, we found it quite appalling, as we made clear in a letter to the two Teals that we sent earlier today. It's not difficult to do the right thing in these circumstances. It's not difficult to look at the slaughter of 1,400 people in their homes, at 250 young people massacred at a rave, to look at scenes of babies slain in their cribs, of people dragged off to captivity. 200 people, 200 Israeli civilians remain in captivity by the sadists and barbarians that Hamas are in Gaza at the moment. It's not difficult to look at that and just to simply condemn it. But these Teals, unfortunately, felt compelled to engage in these moral equivalences, these false equivalences, and side with the Greens. And as you said, they both issued statements this morning which whitewashed the fact that they stood with the Greens temporarily and only highlighted the fact that they ended up voting in favour of the resolution. but their conduct has been noted and it won't be forgotten.
Yeah, I'm interested in that won't be forgotten bit because we know a lot of these teal seats have significant populations of Jewish Australians. What sort of reaction in those communities have come from this pretty shameful behaviour?
Well, I know that the members of the Jewish community in those seats are absolutely appalled and outraged, and many of them have contacted their MPs to let them know exactly how they feel, how let down they feel. But I don't think it'll just be the Jewish community that has its say on this issue at the next election. I think all Australians, all voters look to integrity and principle and look to see how their MPs act in these defining moments. And the fact that they acted so shockingly showed such a moral lapse in a critical time, in a time when the Jewish people are hurting, when Western civilization has taken such a blow. I think that they'll be punished at the polls next time. Look,
you are right to remind us it's not just the Jewish community that's disgusted by these sorts of comments from the two women that we saw yesterday and the attempt to wind it back today, which is, I just think is incredible. I've got to ask you too about comments. They came in late this afternoon. Labor Senator Fatima Payman, she condemned Israel for its response to the Hamas terror attacks. Watch this.
The killing of innocent civilians in Israel should be condemned, and we condemn it. The killing of innocent civilians in Palestine should also be condemned, and we must condemn it. The price tag of Israel's right to defend itself cannot be the destruction of Palestine. Israel's right to defend its civilians cannot equate to the annihilation of Palestinian civilians. I hereby call for an immediate ceasefire to come into effect.
I mean, how does Israel, if you follow her logic, fight back against terrorists with one arm tied behind their back?
Well, there are those who want us to very quickly forget the scenes of a week ago, those horrors, and to forget that 200 Israeli citizens remain in captivity. And they want to draw us into these arguments about root causes and false equivalences and both sides and this sort of nonsense. But all decent people will recall what happened, the atrocities that occurred. We certainly will never forget them. And the fact that what Israel now does, it's not about harming Palestinian civilians. No one is interested in doing that. That's where Israel is different to Hamas. It's about returning the captives to freedom. It's about eradicating Hamas entirely and ensuring that in future they can never do this sort of thing again. So these sorts of arguments about both sides and protecting civilian life, both in Israel and the Palestinian territories, they miss the mark completely.
What about this line that you can be anti-Israel, but that doesn't make you anti-Semitic? Because I've seen that line crossed repeatedly in recent days.
One can certainly criticise Israeli politicians and aspects of Israeli policy, and no decent person, no reasonable person would consider that to be anti-Semitic. No one has ever made that argument. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is individuals who claim to be pro-Palestinian or critical of Israel really reveal themselves for having a very deep-seated hatred of the state of Israel, hitting at it in its darkest, most traumatic period of time, attempting to draw equivalences between the state of Israel and the terrorists that it needs to fight. So I think there's a very clear distinction between reasonable objections to matters of policy and something far more deep-seated and something far more elemental, which is often a contempt for the Jewish people, expressed as a criticism of Israel.
And the right to Israel existing at all. Alex Rivkin, thank you for your time. All right, after the break, the Chief No campaigner, Warren Mundine, and we're going to talk about a whole lot of things. Pretty fiery night for Warren. He'll explain why. Plus, we'll get the latest on the Australian Human Rights Commission's insane ruling that lesbians are not allowed to exclude biological men from lesbian-only events. Coming up, we'll get an update on those calls for global jihad. We're seeing some terror attacks now in Europe. I'll get to all those details. And President Biden is flying to Israel this week to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. A couple of different theories about what this is about. I'll get into that as well. But first, to a man who flies in the face of Labor's claim that the Voice was the only way for Indigenous Australians to get ahead. He's a successful businessman. He's a well-regarded political strategist. He was the national president of the Labor Party until he quit in 2012 to become chairman of Tony Abbott's Indigenous Advisory Council. He's one of the core group of people who led the successful No campaign, and he is, of course, a proud Indigenous Australian himself. I'm speaking here, of course, about Warren Mundine, and I'm delighted to say he joins me now. Well, I tell you what, we know voters, Warren, we've been called dinosaurs, D-heads, racists, a whole lot more. But last night on The Project, a new label was added to the list.
The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. So if you are in a seat that had high levels of tertiary education, a bachelor or postgrad, then you were at the very top end of the yes vote. And if you had the lowest levels of tertiary education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. And that's not to say people who are educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. It's about the style of the message, I think.
So not just dinosaurs, D-heads, racists, but now we're dumb. I mean, what don't they get here? I don't think Australians could have spoke any more clearly or any more loudly on Saturday night.
I just find that hilarious. You know, look, we live in a democracy. We must respect the vote and the outcomes of our elections. And over the decades, I've been in the winning camp and I've been in the losing camp. And you must respect the Australian people and the choices they have made. It may hurt you. It may, may not like it. But we live in a democracy and we got to, start getting back to that. I'm sure John Howard, when he lost the 2007 election, was heartbroken at that, but he was dignified. He didn't blame anyone. He just come out and conceded and moved on. And same with, prime ministers before that, going back through the entire history of Federation. These blokes cannot understand why people voted against them. They are, I just find it bizarre. If you're looking at, and it was a massacre. I was thinking of calling the homicide squad on Saturday night, because of and I thought I was going to be arrested because we just smashed them. The Australian public just smashed them and said, we want nothing to do with this voice. We want nothing to do with this, with the Makaratta Commission. What we want, and it was a very clear message, what we want is the systems that we have now to actually do their job. They're given billions of dollars to close the gap. The question's got to be, what have they been doing with that money?
Oh, spot on. I mean, I did like it. You kept your cool all the way through the campaign, but when you got some pretty ridiculous questions from the media on Saturday night, you let them know about it. Watch this.
Where's about getting results, getting people reducing suicide, and instead of this nonsense that you people carry on with? It's about time. We had a vote tonight that said Australians want to get things done.
Please tell us, after this result now, you're going to keep that fire in your belly, about audits, about finding out where the money that leaves Canberra in its billions but never gets to the ground, where that money goes, that you'll go after land councils who don't let Aboriginal people to own land, to build a business, to try and get ahead. This is going to be the next campaign, I hope, for you, Warren. Please tell me that's true.
That is true, and it's also about the attack on free speech. This bill that's been put forward by the federal government, it's the second biggest go that a Labor government has attacked free speech in this country, and we've got to fight against that. This truth telling, this disinformation and misinformation. The real facts are, and we've seen this in the polling, was that when people read the pamphlet that was put out by the AEC, the vote for the Yes campaign went down. And that went down because they started to see the dangers. They started to see this thing which was a magic wand. No one was prepared to tell them how, come out and give us the details and tell us how it was going to fix everything. They just kept on saying, oh, no, child molestation, it'll be fixed by the voice. This, crime in Aboriginal communities will be fixed by the voice. Unemployment will be fixed by the voice, and none of it. You know, how do you actually get an advisory committee and that can be its advice can be rejected? This is their words, not mine. Can be rejected by the government, and that's what we're doing now. And now they want to put it in the constitution. Look, we had the vote. We need to move on. We need to bring people back together and focus on the real issues. And this is what I'm going to be out there doing every day, is get back to the real issues about, 9-year-old kids who have been committing suicide in Aboriginal communities. You know, when I was 9 years old, all I wanted to do was kick a footy around with my brothers and my mates, and looking forward to a good life. They're looking at their future and they can't see nothing, and so they commit suicide. For God's sake, it's about time the media woke up and started asking the real questions of governments at state, territory and federal level to do their job.
I want to read out a letter that I know you've only got in the last couple of hours. It's an email. Really moving. And this is from a bloke, and I'll read out what he said. He says, I've never done anything political in my life, but I was so disgusted by the guilt politics that have infected this country that I stood for 11 hours out the front of my polling booth alone in Victoria. And when I finally got home and took off my shoes and sat down, it was with a sense of shame that my one day must pale into insignificance to what you and Jacinta Price and your families must have had to endure over this period. My children, he says, have never seen me cry, but I was moved to tears when I saw your outburst at the media because I feel the same way too. I've rarely felt more humbled than now and am proud to have done my tiny part in this small victory for common sense and logic. Now, I've left the bloke's name out because he took on all the yes people at his polling booth. He was the only no person handing out. I might add that polling booth went 65%, I think, the way of no. So he's a pretty powerful individual. But, I mean, I read that and had tears in my eyes too, Warren.
Look, the Australian people, I'm so proud of them. I'm so proud of people like him. I went around the polling booths and the pre-polling in Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And we were struggling, and we didn't have the money and things like that. And we had some booths we couldn't even man, and yet those booths still got a no vote. And I'm just so proud of him. He is an amazing, amazing human being. And I met heaps of them out there who were being abused on the polling booths, being attacked. I've always been polite and to volunteers, no matter what political party they're in, no matter what, because democracy works when people come out and volunteer and help the process, help the candidates and all that. And so I always put my hand out to shake their hand. And for the first time in my life, and I've been doing this for 30 years, people refused to shake my hand. They gave me dirty looks.
Wow.
But I gotta say that not all people were like that. There were some beautiful people who come up and gave me a cuddle from the Yes campaign, and I even got photos with them. It is, this minority of people who are whinging now because they can't accept the democratic process.
Well, keep it up. You've got your campaign mojo back now. We'll see what happens next. Free speech is Warren Mundine's coming out to protect you and more. Thank you for your time, mate. Well done. A magnificent campaign from you too. All right, after the break, Senator Claire Chandler, the Human Rights Commission decision that upends biological reality. And why is Biden racing off to Israel to try and support them or try and tell them not to go after Hamas? Coming up, a former Hamas leader has called for a global day of jihad as terror attacks now resume again in Europe, particularly Belgium and in France. But first to Victoria, where the rights of women have been, dealt another crushing defeat. This morning it was revealed that a lesbian community organisation will be forced to keep its events open to men, straight women and transgender women after the Australian Human Rights Commission refused to grant it an exemption from anti-discrimination laws. The Australian Human Rights Commission even ruled that the word sex is not a biological concept, referring to whether a person at birth had male or female physical traits, nor is it a binary concept limited to the male or female sex. Sex, it said, can refer to a person being male, female or another non-binary state. It is also broad enough, this is the Human Rights Commission, broad enough to encompass the idea that a person's sex can be changed. Joining me to discuss this, one of our most outspoken pro-women leaders in the Senate, Senator Claire Chandler. Claire, welcome. I saw this story, knew I had to talk to you tonight. What do you make of this decision from the Human Rights Commission?
Well, let's be very frank about it, Peter. It is a terrible decision and just the latest example of what happens when woke left activists take over our bureaucracy and our institutions. If we are in a situation where the Australian Human Rights Commission has, in effect, decoupled the concept of biological reality from the concept of sex, then we can hardly be surprised that women and girls in Australia don't have a guaranteed right to access single-sex sports and single-sex spaces and single-sex services. So a completely mad decision by the AHRC, but sadly something that we have become all too used to seeing.
Yeah, Claire, because just go through this for the people at home too who may not be crossed all the nuances of language. Gender was the term that had allowed a whole lot of various groupings to emerge. I mean, anyone could be anything in gender. But on the issue of sex, it all came down to the science, to chromosomes, to biological reality. Now, if the Human Rights Commission is not just throwing gender up in the air, but it's now throwing biological sex up in the air, we're crossing a Rubicon here. There'll be no guarantees that women can walk into a toilet and just be women in the toilet or women and girls in the change room. I mean, this is a big deal.
Well, that's exactly right, Peter. And I've been on your show many times before talking about why we found ourselves in this situation. And I think particularly when it comes to this new apparent construction of what sex means, according to the AHRC, we only have to look back to the fact that the Sex Discrimination Act no longer defines what a man is and what a woman is. So if you take out those binary concepts from the legislation, well, no wonder you have these crazy interpretations of what sex might be now in 2023. I mean, I think sex is what it always has had the ordinary definition of meaning, but apparently the AHRC doesn't agree.
And the spokeswoman, Carol Ann, for this group, she said it wasn't an unexpected decision. She says it's disgraceful. She says it puts us back in the closet if we ever want to have any events for lesbians who were born female. I guess the challenge with all of this, I mean, what happens now to the right of women to be in a female-only domestic violence shelter?
Well, at the end of the day, they don't have that right in this country, Peter. And I mean, you look at the Sex Discrimination Act itself. I don't think anyone can argue that this piece of legislation that was created for, very genuine and serious reasons is actually serving the rights of women anymore. If being a woman isn't protected under the Sex Discrimination Act, then where else is it going to be? It's an absolutely terrible state of affairs.
Just quickly before we go, Claire, I mean, we're finding overseas, particularly say in the UK, all the politicians, left and right, are falling over themselves to define women as an adult female. They're winding back this stuff. Yet here in Australia, we're going the other way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we obviously had a conversation during the federal election last year about what a woman was and the importance of women's sports and women's services. But ever since that election, the Albanese government has shown no interest in changing the legislation that we're talking about here to ensuring that under the law, women and girls have the right to single-sex spaces and services. So, frankly, it's up to the government to take these issues seriously, and I'm not surprised that we're regressing here in Australia under a Labor government.
I know you're going to be firing the Senate about it. Thank you for your time tonight, Claire. Coming up, billions and billions of dollars of UN money pumped into Gaza, supposedly for aid, but straight into the hands of Hamas. And Biden's agenda when he gets to Israel, those attacks in Belgium as well. All right, joining me for a race around the world with a few international issues. My international panel tonight, of course, Sky News contributor Kosha Carter, former Labor MP Michael Danby. Michael, start with you. We know Joe Biden will be in Israel, perhaps towards the end of the week. They're saying Thursday. I suspect they'll guard the security a bit closely. There is talk, though, that he's not just going to send a signal of support, he's also going to try and get Bibi Netanyahu to wind back on ongoing full-scale war against Hamas. Will that work?
No. I've spoken to people in the National Unity Government, and right across the political spectrum, military operations are going to be done to remove Hamas. More and more stuff is emerging of what happened in those terrible days on the 7th of October. And Joe Biden might be able to restrain them in doing this or that operation, but it's going to go ahead. And the Americans will try and not get involved with their aircraft carriers off the coast of Lebanon if Hezbollah gets involved. But there's a very big danger. The Russians have S-400 anti-aircraft missiles. If the Israelis are flying over Lebanon to suppress the huge number of missiles, much bigger than Hamas, coming into Israel, then if the Russians get involved, it's a really big problem.
Talk to me about this call from a former Hamas leader to have a global day of jihad. We know 2 Swedish tourists have been killed in Belgium, connected to Islamic State. That's what the person involved says, and the terror suspect says. We had a Chechen kill a teacher in France, again, Islamist type behaviour. It feels like we're back where we were a few years ago.
It does. I think these atrocities from last weekend are sort of seen to be lighting a fuse of something that maybe has been simmering for a while, placated for a while, but never quite gone away. And I think we've talked about this, Peter, in previous contexts as well, that one consequence of immigration at the scale at which has happened in the last half century in most of the Western world is that you don't know. You're importing people with different allegiances, value systems, philosophies. And when this fuse gets lit, those things bubble up to the surface. And we're seeing that with protests and rallies and even acts of terror, potentially. I think the other dynamic at play is just the cultural shift that we're just in. For a lot of people, everything is viewed now through this prism of oppressed and oppressor, colonizer, decolonizer. And so every issue in the world is getting stuffed into that prism. And you put all that together, it's a bit of a perfect storm for, I think, unfortunately, these kinds of things now, more to come.
The president aside, the US, how's this playing out with the Congress? I mean, we're on the cusp of really getting into a US election. How is this being seen and acted upon in the US?
Well, we're not even sure that Jim Jordan will have a majority to be the Speaker. America is adrift. Matt Gaetz blew up the Congress and he had no plan. There's urgent appropriations for Israel, Ukraine and Taiwan. What if the Chinese attack Taiwan during this period when the Americans are on the back foot in the Middle East and in Europe? There's no appropriations. Honestly, this is, you worry about America. And I was astonished to hear that some of the Gates people were saying that Qatar, which is hosting the Iranian foreign minister and the heads of Hamas staying at the Four Seasons Hotel in Doha, Peter, that America shouldn't be involved in sanctioning them because it would be getting involved overseas. I mean, talk about nuts. America is the leader of the free world. I'm not sure that Sleepy Joe is up to it, but at least he's got the right sentiments. But we need the American Congress too.
Hey, just quickly, we had a change of government in New Zealand, Labor out, Nationals in. Does that mean we're going to get rid of the Ardern, Green, woke legacy as well?
Seems like a little bit, for sure. And I know the coalition has a faction with 11 seats or so that's even more to the right, which will pull the centre of gravity in that direction. But I think a lot of what the Ardern administration did is deep-seated, so it's not going to happen overnight, and I'm sure they're going to be met with resistance, just like right-wing governments are, I think, in much of the Western world.
All strength of our arm, though, because a lot of that stuff comes here. Thanks, Kosha. Thank you, Michael. All right, that's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew.